Hi guys, so I wanted to do a response video to my good friend Jeff Taylor, who's a Brexiteer and an ex-politician actually. So let's hear what he had to say.
Over the last 5 days, the UK and EU Brexit negotiating teams under David Frost and Michel Barnier respectively have been engaged in the third round of talks on the future UK-EU relationship. And as I said before the talks started, I thought there'd be little progress. And there hasn't been, but it wouldn't have taken a rocket scientist to get that prediction right. Because the two sides are still very far apart in their thinking. And on the UK side, David Frost has issued a statement saying that he regrets that we made very little progress towards agreement on the most significant outstanding issues between us. But he did say that it is very clear that a standard, comprehensive free trade agreement with other key agreements on issues like law enforcement, civil nuclear and aviation alongside, all in line with the political declaration, could be agreed without major difficulties in the time available. But he went on to say that the major obstacle to this is the EU's insistence on including a set of novel and unbalanced proposals on the so-called level playing field, which would bind this country to EU law or standards or determine our domestic legal regimes in a way that is unprecedented in free trade agreements and not envisaged in the political declaration.
Okay, so the problem here with the level playing field is that what it stipulates is that if the UK wants to have trade deals with the European Union, then it needs to respect certain requirements. So them being, for example, environmental standards, goods and services standards, and workers' rights. Now, these are things that the UK government have rejected. They don't want to maintain these standards or rights. So what Jeff is defending, I assume here, is the idea that he doesn't want to protect environmental, good standards or workers' rights.
As soon as the EU recognises that we will not conclude an agreement on that basis, we will be able to make progress. He then went on to talk about fisheries and said that the UK is fully committed to agreeing fishing provisions, but that we cannot agree to arrangements that are manifestly unbalanced and against the interests of the UK fishing industry. And then he said,
This issue of fisheries, I just really don't understand. Because fisheries represent a tiny minority of British industry. But it seems to be a political hot potato. It seems to be something that Brexiteers rally around. And this is one of the reasons fisheries is brought up so often. Fisheries represent, as I said, a very small minority of British industry, but it seems to be the one that's defended tooth and nail. And the only conclusion I can come to is it's been defended for political reasons, not for economic reasons, not because it's protecting jobs. It's for political reasons. It's something that Brexiteers have taken to heart, and the government are worried about losing support from Brexiteers if fisheries is not protected. But it's been protected at the expense of much more important industry.
it is hard to understand why the EU insists on an ideological approach which makes it more difficult to reach a mutually beneficial agreement.
Ideological approach. This is political language. This is not based on reality. He's injecting weasel words here into this statement in order to influence the British public and the media at home.
The underlining of the word which is Frost's, not mine. And he went on by saying, "We very much need a change in EU approach for the next round beginning on the 1st of June. Now from the EU side, Michel Barnier had a pop at the UK. But he did agree with the UK team on two things when he said..."
Okay, just before he comes to this point, David Frost asked for the EU to change its position. And the EU responded by saying, no, you change your position. And Jeff has a problem with that.
With the exception of a few modest overtures, no progress was possible on the other most difficult subjects. And we were also able to start a dialogue on fisheries, even if our positions remained strongly divergent. But the rest was all about the UK being unreasonable in not agreeing to be bound up like a kipper. And on the EU dream of a level playing field, he said, on this subject it was a round of divergence without any progress. I say good.
Why good? Why do you want the UK to throw out environmental goods and workers' rights? Environmental standards, goods standards and workers' rights. Why is that good? Why is it good to throw those away? I know it doesn't affect you personally, Jeff, but it does affect thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers. The European Union has set standards for workers' rights, and you want to throw those away. For what reason? Why is it a sticking point? The only conclusion I can come to is that it's a problem not for the Tories themselves, but for their donors, for the people who support the party financially. They would prefer to have lower standards for workers, fewer rights for workers, because it would benefit them. I don't see how it benefits you. I don't know how it benefits the majority of people who supported Brexit. It actually damages most people who are working class, or at least who aren't millionaires and billionaires.
Because being confined to a Brussels-controlled straitjacket after all those years of actively and successfully campaigning to leave the EU does not sound like progress to me.
Of course it doesn't sound like progress to you, because you don't understand what these standards and what these rights are about. You would prefer to throw them away for ideological reasons. And I'm assuming it's ideological reasons, because unless the alternative is you're profiting from this in some way. Are you a millionaire? Are you a billionaire who's just about to profit from all of this? How are your rights damaged by the European Union, being a member of the European Union? How are your rights going to improve after the transition period?
He also reported that he was unable to make progress on the EU requirement that we have a single governance framework for our future deal. Once again, I say good.
You need to have a single governing body, because you need someone who will judicate between the two parties. What is the problem here? I don't understand why you have a problem with an independent body judicating here.
Because the EU would almost certainly see that being under the jurisdiction of the ECJ in the final analysis.
And okay, now this is where I really have a problem. Does Jeff not understand that the ECJ is not the EU? Now, he either doesn't know that the European Court of Justice is not part of the EU, or he's pretending not to know so that his audience are confused or misled. The ECJ and the EU are two separate entities. Just because they have the word European in them doesn't mean that they are the same. Of course, and I'm struggling to understand whether Jeff doesn't know this or he's pretending not to know it. Because if he doesn't know it, then he needs to do some research. If he's pretending not to know it, then this is telling a lie. This is lying to his audience. They are two separate bodies, but the European Court of Justice judicates between the European Union and other entities, other countries, on trade, for example. So he can't say that it's a good idea not to include the ECJ. If the European Union, which is the bigger body, decides, look, we want to have an independent body such as the European Court of Justice to adjudicate, and the UK says no, then there'll be no agreement. And then who are you going to have adjudicate? Because once again, this is the thing that Brexiteers don't seem to understand. If you have no deal, the day after, what are you going to have? You're going to have to start a negotiation. And then you're going to have someone adjudicate. And who's going to decide who's going to adjudicate? The bigger entity. I really don't understand how Brexiteers don't understand this. They keep banging on about having a no deal. We can walk away. Okay, you can do that. That can happen. But the day after, what's going to happen? You're going to have to sit down again with the EU, and they're going to say, okay, who are we going to agree to adjudicate when we have a disagreement? Who? Please tell me. I would like to know who you would recommend to adjudicate between the EU and the UK when there is a disagreement. But I never hear any response from the Brexiteers to this question.
But the one comment that should not be overlooked was when Barnier said, "The very firm position of our member states is that without a level playing field and without an agreement on fisheries, there will be no agreement on our economic and commercial partnership. As well as, we are not going to haggle our European values for the benefit of the British economy."
And here he is defending his position. His job is to defend the European Union's positions on trade, on rights, on finance, on whatever you want to deal with. On services, on trade, whatever whatever issue you want to deal with, his position is to defend the European position. I don't understand why that's a problem for you, or I don't understand why that's something strange.
That sounds very much to me like no deal outcome is now highly possible.
You still don't understand that the European Union would prefer to have no deal than to allow the UK to run roughshod over the EU's standards. The EU will always defend itself over having a trade deal with the UK. They're very simple about, they're very clear about this. They have said it on numerous occasions. And you still don't understand it. You still think that you can pressure them into changing their standards to suit you. Why would they do that? They are much bigger than you are. They're a much bigger market. They have much more power in the world. It's like, just compare this with the United States. Would the United States bend over to support the UK? No, they wouldn't, and no one would imagine they would. So why do you think that the EU would?
And I would not expect the UK government to haggle UK values for the benefit of the single market. We've done enough of that over the years already.
So I'm not actually going to criticize his comment about the UK, but who is in charge of the UK now? Who is the government of the UK? Boris Johnson and the Tories. Do you honestly think that the Boris Johnson and the Tories give a crap about the UK? About principles? Do you think Boris Johnson has principles? Do you think the Tories actually have principles? That they would defend the UK under any circumstance? You've seen examples of them willing to sell off the NHS to American companies just last year, while at the same time saying we are going to defend the NHS. Now, if those are their principles, why do you think that they would care about Brexit? Why do you think they would care about defending the UK interests when they wouldn't care about defending the NHS interests? They'll tell the public, we're fighting in your interests. We're fighting for you. We're fighting for the UK. But what they do behind closed doors is completely different. Surely you understand that. Surely you're not that naive, Jeff, that you think that Boris Johnson and the Tories don't say one thing in public and something else behind closed doors.
And in a throwback to the old mantra of they didn't know what they were voting for, Barnier said, "It seems to me that there is a real misunderstanding in the United Kingdom today about the objective and sometimes mechanical consequences of the British choice to leave the single market and the customs union."
And he's right. Most people don't understand what the situation is. You don't understand the situation because you still think that you have some sort of control over the EU, that you still think that you and the UK are able to force the EU into changing its principles. For what? For some trade on fish? For some trade with the UK on goods and services? That the UK, and at the same time the UK has left, that you're now an external country, you're not part of the EU, you're no longer a member, and you still think that the EU is going to bend over backwards to satisfy Boris Johnson and the Tories because he has a majority in Parliament. What planet are you living on?
And he ended this part by telling the UK it needed to change its attitude. To progress in this negotiation, he said, "If it is still the United Kingdom's intention to obtain an agreement with the European Union, the United Kingdom will have to be more realistic, overcome this misunderstanding and, no doubt, change its strategy."
And this is typical language you use when you're negotiating. You're saying if you want to have a successful negotiation, you need to change your attitude. The UK is saying exactly the same thing at the beginning of this video, that the EU needs to change its attitude. But you didn't have a problem with that. But you have a problem with this. I don't have a problem with the UK saying the EU needs to change its attitude, because it's just words. They understand deep down that the EU is not going to change. But this is theatre. This is political razzmatazz. It's an attempt to convince the public and the media and people like you that they're doing something, when in reality they're not doing anything. The EU is, in a way, doing a similar thing. The EU knows that this is going to end up in a shambles, but they're saying our position is that the UK needs to change. So one is blaming the other, but at the end of the day, one is going to come out damaged and the other is going to come out in a catastrophe. Now, Boris Johnson may not be around as Prime Minister when the UK eventually leaves without the extension, and there is a disaster. But you seem to be happy with that.
You cannot have the best of both worlds. But don't forget that the European Union is desperate for the UK to agree to extend the transition period beyond the 31st of December this year.
And please, here, I want to hear some evidence for this. This constant mantra from the Brexiteers, they need us more than we need them. They're desperate to extend the transition period. They're demanding to extend the transition period. But they're not. There's no evidence to support that. I'd like to hear some actual evidence that the EU wants the UK to extend the transition period. They have said very clearly, if you want to have a particular deal, a comprehensive deal, you need a certain amount of time. Boris Johnson said, no, we want to have it done in a year. They have said it's not enough time. So you can either have nothing or you can extend. It's like, as I've said before, if somebody wants to build a house and the normal time to build a house is 3 months, and you say, I want a house built in 1 month, well, the builders will say, well, you're not going to get your house built in 1 month. You need to extend your time frame to 3 months. But the UK is deciding, we don't want to extend. You're forcing us to extend. The builder is forcing me to extend the time frame from 1 month to 3 months. No, the builder is telling you if you want it done right, it takes 3 months. You're the one who's deciding that you want it done in 1 month. And the Brexiteers don't seem to understand this either.
That way they could screw more out of us, as well as tying us down with their post-health crisis rules and regulations, and while weaving the UK into any rescue packages put together to keep the Eurozone afloat.
So it's this constant lie. Yes, it's the EU want us in because they need us to pay. The EU have said if you want to leave, you can leave. But if you want to have a trade deal with us, I keep repeating myself over this. If you want to have a trade deal with us, you need to agree certain rules and conditions. In any type of agreement, there has to be rules and conditions on both sides. Sometimes the bigger entity decides and the smaller entity accepts. That's how it works. The UK is a much smaller economy. It's much more diminished over the last few years. And you're expecting what? I really don't understand. You have this inflated idea of the empire, perhaps, that you still have. I'm not talking about British people, I'm talking about Jeff here. He must have this inflated idea that the UK is still an empire and the EU is some backwater that's pleading with the UK to stay because it's desperate. What planet are you living on?
Now, Michel Barnier also included a response to the rather comprehensive letter Michael Gove sent to the EU Commission on the rights of UK citizens in the EU post-IP and the worries the UK government has that the EU is not doing enough on this issue, something I talked about in a video this morning. Barnier said that guidance has been issued to EU member states on how to proceed with protecting the rights of UK citizens living in the EU post-IP.
See, there are so many different things to talk about here. So first of all, the Brexiteers will say that the EU decides everything, that member states are shackled to the EU and they're not free to do whatever they want. But the EU has explained to different member states, if UK citizens are living in your countries, you have to respect them. Now, some countries are doing it in some ways, and other countries are doing it in different ways. Some countries are maybe not doing enough, and other countries are doing enough. So if there's a different approach taking place in different countries, then how are these countries shackled to the laws of the European Union? Now the European Union has stepped in and said, look, we think there should be respect, and UK citizens living in your countries should have access to whatever they need after Brexit, after the UK has left. Services, health, whatever. That's what the EU is starting to do now. And you as a Brexiteer are complaining that the EU is asking member states to defend the rights of UK citizens. So you prefer the EU left UK citizens to be thrown under a bus? Really, I don't understand what your angle is here. You would prefer UK citizens to suffer than for the EU to attempt to defend them.
But we will also be watching closely, he said, to make sure that EU citizens residing in the UK do not face unfair treatment or discrimination. The European Parliament is particularly attentive to this.
And that's good. I assume you would like EU citizens to be treated with respect in the UK, in the same way you would like UK citizens to be treated with respect in the EU countries. I would like all people to be treated with respect. I don't have a problem with that. I would hope that EU citizens living in the UK will be treated fairly. And I hope UK citizens living in the EU will be treated fairly.
I wonder how many Yellow Vest protesters in Paris would agree with him that the EU is even faintly bothered with the rights of its citizens.
Sorry, what is this? A whataboutism? Now we're going in a different direction. Yellow jacket. What has this got to do with UK citizens living in the EU, or EU citizens living in the UK? You understand that the EU can't enforce this. It's a suggestion. But once again, you're complaining about the EU overreaching, but this overreach is about protecting citizens, and you have a problem with that. So you'd prefer these citizens to be thrown under a bus for ideological reasons. But then this is the Brexiteer mentality. It's not about protecting the environment. It's not about protecting workers' rights. It's about protecting Brexit, protecting an ideology.
And the Greeks, Italians and the Catalonians. And just today it's reported that there have been protests in Germany, France, Austria and now Spain, all largely aimed at the EU and their member state governments for their handling of the pandemic.
No. It's nice how he says there are reports. And then he attaches the EU. No, there are people protesting against their governments, not against the EU. What has the EU got to do with a lockdown in Germany or in a part of Germany? Zero. What has the EU got to do with the lockdown taking place in Italy? Zero. I know you'd like to attach that and blame the EU some way. You're like, how can I blame the EU for this? It's like, it's raining today. How can I blame the EU for this? There are people who do blame the EU for everything. You know, they have problems with in their relationships. Let's blame the EU for that. But I'm sorry, Jeff. You can't blame the EU for this. Okay. Now there are, of course, people. The evidence to support this is because there are people in the United States who are protesting against the governors of their states imposing a lockdown. Now, these people are insane. They're crazy. They're conspiracy theorists. But that doesn't mean that because they're protesting in the EU countries, that means it's against the EU. I understand for you as a Brexiteer, anything that happens bad, anything bad that happens in the EU as a state, as an entity, you automatically blame the EU for it. But I'm sorry, reality is somewhat different.
And once the icy hand of an economic slump grips them, the protesting voices will only get louder. But back on topic, the UK will not play on an EU so-called level playing field, and the EU won't play unless they can have all our fish. Looks like no deal then. Now, going off on a tangent, the EU Commission has today put in motion two very interesting European citizens' initiatives.
What? The EU is listening to its citizens?
Now, a European Citizens' Initiative is a sort of EU-wide referendum system.
Sorry, I'm very confused here, Jeff. Are you implying that the EU actually listens to its citizens and actually offers them a vote?
You start with at least 7 EU citizens from 7 different countries agreeing on a policy they'd like to see initiated. Then they register it. Then if they gain verified support...
Sorry, Jeff, you need to slow down here. You're describing a democracy. And I've been told by Brexiteers for years that the European Union is anti-democratic. But please go on.
From 1 million people from across at least 7 EU member states within 1 year, then the EU Commission has to look at it and within 6 months spell out what action it will propose in response to your initiative, if any, and its reasons for taking or not taking action.
And this is bad.
And if the EU commissioners like it, they will start formulating legislation, if any is required. So it's a bit like the...
If the EU commissioners like it, it's a very subjective word to use. If they like it, you know, if there's sufficient support, could be maybe a better use of language here. If they like it.
The UK petition process, but with a more direct route into helping form law. So what are these two?
You're making it sound like the EU is something good here. Jeff, you have to return to the message. The EU is bad. Remember, the EU is bad. Stop giving us examples of how the EU is good. You're going to upset a lot of your supporters on this channel.
Proposals. Well, the first one is for an unconditional basic income, or UBI, across the European Union. That's right, the EU Commission has set in motion a European Citizens Initiative that says, our aim is to establish the introduction of unconditional basic incomes throughout the EU, which ensure every person's material existence and opportunity to participate in society as part of its economic policy.
So a UBI, a Universal Basic Income, which I've been promoting on this channel for a long time, which I think is a good idea because we're moving into a new society. After this current crisis, we're going to move into a new society where jobs are going to be much fewer, and we're going to experience the impact of also AI, robotics and automation, which are going to decimate industries. And many people are going to be laid off. Many people are going to lose their jobs. And these are jobs that are not going to come back. And these workers are not going to be able to train up, learn coding or whatever, or learn a new skill in order to get a job. Whatever jobs they're going to train for are going to be replaced by machines as well. So a UBI is a good idea. Now we can agree or disagree or debate on some of the details of a UBI, but in general, I support this. A UBI is a good idea.
Now, the organiser of this is Klaus Sambor, who has, I think, been working on this UBI concept for many years. But maybe now, with all the economic fallout from the invisible enemy, he feels that this is exactly the right time to strike and get support right across the EU. And it could well be popular with millions of EU citizens, even if not with its governments and the banks.
But it's many of the times the governments don't agree with it because they don't understand it, because they believe that it's a type of welfare, that really it's a misunderstanding. Governments are afraid of change. And you're pointing to the EU governments, but this is a problem all over the world. Many governments are afraid to implement a UBI because they're afraid of the change and the impact it will have. But that's not a criticism against UBI. That's a criticism against those individual governments.
So why am I mentioning it? Well, the further across the EU this is advertised and highlighted, the more likely people are to sign up to it. And the more millions that do, the harder it will be for the EU Commission to ignore it. And the Commission answer to this one will, I would think, always have to be no, as they reminded the little people that they exist to pay the EU and not the other way around.
Why? Have you got evidence to support that they would be against this UBI? You have to understand that if there's a lot of support, the politicians will put their finger in the wind and they will follow that. See, the problem with the UBI at the moment is you ask people on the street, they have no understanding of UBI. They've never heard of it in many cases. So the support for UBI is quite low. So politicians will not support it because there's too much of a risk for them personally. But if the majority of people support a UBI, then the politicians will support it. You have this dogmatic position that the EU is bad, I'm against the EU, so that if somebody presents something to the EU, then my position is that they will always disagree with it. Because I think that they will always disagree with it. But the EU and the European Commission is made up of politicians. If there's pressure put on politicians, or even if it's not even pressure, if the politicians see the wind blowing in a particular direction, they'll go with that. They're politicians. They're not, in many cases, ideologues who have a strict way of thinking. They follow the votes. If the votes support a UBI, then they will support a UBI. If you don't agree with me, if you think I'm wrong here, look at the issue. Look at any other issue, especially social issues over the last 10 years. Gay marriage, for example. In Ireland, if you were to talk about gay marriage 20 years ago, people would think you were insane. It would be impossible for Catholic Ireland to support gay marriage. And then a few years ago, it passed, and it was passed during the session, during the Parliament, where you had a gay Prime Minister, Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. Imagine telling people 20 years ago, in Ireland you would have a gay Prime Minister, and gay marriage would pass, and abortion rights would pass as well. People would think you were insane. They said, don't worry, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100 years. No. In a very short period of time, the politicians follow. Why? But did the politicians have a change of mind? No. The politicians followed the crowd. The politicians follow votes. Society changed, and society pushed the politicians in that direction. The same in the United States. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. These were people 12 years ago were saying that marriage is between a man and a woman. As soon as the situation changed, as soon as society started to accept the alternative, the politicians accepted it and they promoted it. They were saying, yes, I was on board from day one. Of course, it was a lie. Politicians will follow wherever the wind blows. You are an ex-politician. You should know that. But either you don't know it or you're pretending not to know it.
So the more support this initiative gets in the EU, the more people that the EU Commission will upset when it does say no.
And what evidence do you have to support that? Really? I'd like to see some evidence to say that the EU will say no to this. You're saying they will say no for dogmatic reasons, for ideological reasons, the things that you were criticizing at the beginning of this video. But you don't have any evidence to support that. I don't believe a UBI would be supported by many countries at the moment because the politicians are afraid. But give it enough time and they will support it. But you are taking the position that the EU will reject it because I don't like the EU. And that's not a grounds to base an argument upon. If you want to disagree with the EU on different things, you can do that. But you're disagreeing with the EU because you don't like them. You're making statements that the EU is going to do something or not do something from an ideological point of view that you have, not theirs. Your position is not based on reality. And that's the problem with Brexiteers. Their positions are not based on reality. They're dogmatic. They're set in stone. The EU is bad, the UK is good. The European Commission, European Parliament is bad. Boris Johnson and the Tories are good. Labour is bad, the Tories are good. When Brexit Party is good, everyone else is bad. This is a very limited mindset that they have. He can't look at a UBI and say UBI is good for this, and this reason. I think it should be supported for this, and this reason. He's just saying the UBI is going to be promoted and it's going to fail because the EU want to stop it. But he has no understanding of politics if he's saying something like that. So this video has gone on much longer than I expected, but I had to respond to it because Jeff seems to be able to just say what he wants and not be held accountable to it. Sorry. But once again, if you have any disagreements with me, I'd like to hear them in the comments. As always, I appreciate your comments. Thanks a lot. why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server where we share news, chat, and have some fun. If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.